When you boil Void War down to its most fundamental aspects, the biggest thing that the game asks you to manage is your scrap. Scrap and how you spend it will completely decide how well a run can go. It completely shapes how you kill enemy ships, how strong your defenses are, what equipment and other things you can get. It is the defining aspect of the game. Within that notion, systems become the most defining aspect of most runs. You will spend the majority of your scrap on buying systems, powering systems, and upgrading systems, and they have significant impacts on your run. They do everything from allowing you to actually damage and destroy enemy ships, giving you defensive options to weather enemy barrages, and everything in between. This video is essentially going to be a guide that gives you some general pointers on how to effectively utilize systems, giving you a basis on maybe what systems should be prioritized when buying, what systems are good at certain levels but also shouldn't be upgraded beyond a certain point, and a variety of other things. All of the information I'm going to share here is going to be based around playing on Torment 12, the current highest level of Torment in Void War. This means we are working with the bare minimum amount of scrap and are also facing the strongest bosses and the most well-equipped ships that you will find. For reference, on Torment 10 through 12, your average run is going to earn about 1,400 scrap in total. This is in stark contrast to lower Torments that often have 2,000 or more scrap in total. It's a significant difference, and that is why we're going to be using the high Torments as a baseline, because that is really where you got to get the most out of your scrap in order to be effective. Also, before we get into the systems themselves, you're going to hear me talk about this concept of buffering a system. And what this relates to is essentially the concept of upgrading a system, but not putting power into those upgrades, and instead using those extra upgrades as essentially bonus health on those systems. The reason you would want to do this is systems don't always need to be max leveled in order to be effective. However, systems that are only on 1 bar of power mean if they take any damage, they instantly go down. Buffering is the ability for you to give systems essentially a second or even third level of health, making it harder to actually lose that system when you might need this. I'll talk about it a bit more when we get into it, but I just want you to be aware of that because it is sometimes an important thing to make note of for certain systems. Anyway, with that all said, let's go ahead and jump into our first section of systems, namely subsystems. These are systems that are a bit unique in that they do not take up any slots in your overall system category, but they also do not actually require reactor power to be powered up. Instead, they are automatically powered as long as they are not damaged. On top of this, many of them also start as systems on the vast majority of ships in-game. The Command Throne is the first of our systems, and it is essentially the heart of any ship in-game. The Command Throne has some important aspects. For example, it needs to be powered and manned in order for you to jump between different nodes. It also is how you charge your subspace drive, which can allow you to jump out of a combat if you really need to escape. But probably the biggest thing that it does during combat is that when manned and when your engines and it are active, you are able to utilize evasion, which gives you a chance of dodging enemy shots. The Command Throne can be upgraded 2 times for 30 and then 60 scrap, and the effects of upgrades on top of giving it more health is that you get an autopilot system. Level 2 gives you 50% autopilot, meaning half of your evasion remains active even if no one is manning the system, and then level 3 gives you 80% autopilot. To be completely honest, the command throne is just not really worth upgrading. The reason for this is that the autopilot's giving you only 8% of evasion means that they just aren't really doing a whole lot. And also, in order to get more evasion, you need to then also upgrade your engines. And we'll talk about engines in a little while, but generally you don't want to be upgrading them to massive levels, meaning that autopilots will give you maybe 10 or at most 15 evasion at best. And really, you can just have someone manning it and have the full evasion thing. If the command throne gets damaged, the guy manning the command throne can just repair it and you'll be back to full evasion after a little bit. There just really isn't a lot of reason to spend your precious scrap on command throne. It's just not really a very effective system to be spending on. The next subsystem we're going to talk about is door control. Door control is a system that allows you to open and close doors on your ship while it is powered. Now, keep in mind that even if the door control is destroyed, you can open and close doors by having a crew member in a given room. However, door control allows you to do that anywhere on the ship instead of needing to run your guys around. Door control can be upgraded 2 times, first for 25 scrap and then for 50 scrap, and these essentially give you door reinforcements, which essentially means that enemy units that are on your ship will have to spend time attacking doors to actually get through, instead of being able to freely walk through. Door control can also be manned, increasing its effective level by 1, which can give you up to level 3 doors, which take quite a while for enemies to break down. In general, door control is something that is honestly pretty nice, and you either want to have somebody that is always manning it, or if you have the excess scrap, you want to be able to throw that 25 scrap and get doors 1 on the ship. Being able to essentially control where and how enemies are moving can make dealing with borders much easier. On top of that, it allows you to also always maintain that your doors have some capabilities of venting fires and whatnot. If your door control goes down and a bunch of fire is being spread on your ship, it can very quickly spiral out of control and you can just die from it. So generally, it's not something that is ultra high priority to get, especially early on, but in the mid to late game, I generally try to throw at least the first level of doors on and then have somebody man it. Doors 2 is generally enough to buy you time, and even if that crew member has to stop manning it, you can at least have the level 1 to continue to maintain it. Our third subsystem is going to be sensors. Sensors are essentially a system where your sensors will compare to the enemy sensors, and whoever has higher or at least equal sensor strength will be able to see on the enemy ship. On top of that, sensors are also required in order for you to see on your ship. They only need the base level in order to see your ship, but if they are damaged, then you will lose sight of anything that does not have a crew member in it. Sensors can be upgraded 2 times, one for 25 scrap and a second time for 50 scrap. They can also be manned, meaning that the highest level of sensors in-game is sensors level 4. And to be honest, there's not a lot to say here, but generally you should not be upgrading sensors. They are very low impact, and the only times you would ever really need the sensors is essentially if you are trying to land certain psyker abilities. However, you can also just blow up the enemy sensors to also get vision into their own systems. And generally, it's just not worth spending the scrap on these because they don't provide any real impact outside of just seeing a little bit of the enemy ship. So generally, I would recommend avoiding putting scrap into it unless you are absolutely flooding with it, or your build is very, very specific and really needs to see where enemy crew are at specific times. But even then, you can kind of intuition it if you just pay attention to how the AI works. They'll go to repair damaged rooms and all that. So still, I would just probably not spend much or any scrap on this. Just man it if you can, and that's generally enough. The final subsystem that you will find on ships is the auto surgeon, or medbay, or whatever you want to call it. The auto surgeon is a system that is generally not installed on most ships, unlike the other subsystems. It often has to be purchased from a merchant for 70 scrap. The Auto Surgeon essentially acts as a guaranteed source of healing every time you jump. It is able to, at its base level, provide 1 activation of healing where you will get 4 HP per second while it is active. It can then be upgraded 2 separate times, the first for 30 scrap and the second for 60 scrap. It will then progressively scale, so level 2 will give you 2 activations of it that each heal 8 HP per second, and level 3 will give 3 activations per jump, and they all heal for 12 HP a second. The Auto Surgeon is generally a pretty great system to pick up. The reason for this is it gives you a consistent source of healing on top of the resting that you get in between jumps. It allows you to very often top up crew members that are either boarding the enemy ship or have just taken damage from enemy boarders after a fight, or have needed to deal with fires and poison and the variety of things that can damage your crew members. Even a level 1 Auto Surgeon can be fairly useful in that regard. However, there is also the ability to very cheaply upgrade it and make it so you can sustain even the biggest of boarding crews. Level 2 is almost always something you should be getting, because for an effective 100 scrap in total, you will have 2 activations that heal for 8 HP per second, which is enough that you can even top off knights and other really high health units on top of healing the rest of your crew. Level 3 is a bit more situational. If you really need a lot of healing, like for example against the Necrobarge final boss that often is looking to kill your crew, the Auto Surgeon level 3 can be a great way to give you that last bit of health needed to get over the finish line, but it's not always required. If I have excess scrap, I often do dump it into the Auto Surgeon. It's a very efficient way, but if you see the Auto Surgeon, you should strongly consider picking it up unless you already have a consistent source of healing in other ways that is able to keep your crews topped off. Now, with the subsystems out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to systems that will require reactor power. And this has an important aspect because it means that in general, these systems require more overall scrap in order to make operational. And let's start it off with probably one of the most fundamental systems in the game, and that is shields. Shields provide the crucial defense that stops your hull from taking repeated damage from enemy armament. And as such, it is something that you undeniably have to upgrade throughout the game. However, shields is expensive, and it takes a lot in order to get more of it, because you need to upgrade 2 levels in order to get 1 additional layer of shields. Effectively, this means that your first upgrade of shields requires you to spend 50 scrap on it and then get 2 reactor bars onto it. Level 3 requires 100 scrap, and then level 4 requires 180 scrap plus respective power bars from your reactor. This is a very interesting system to talk about because, in general, shields look like you just want to max it out in every run. However, the truth is that level 4 shields is so expensive, it's actually generally a luxury whether you get it or not, and especially on higher torments, people often stop at level 3. The reason for this, as said, is it is really expensive. The last 2 levels to get level 4 shields costs more than it did for the entire rest of the shield upgrades. And this cost makes it prohibitively expensive when you are so limited on scrap. Generally, high torment runs will go with upgrading their shields at 2 main points. Generally, you want to get level 2 shields around the time of Sector 2 in order to deal with scaling enemy weapons, and then level 3 shields often comes around Sector 5 to 6, where you need that extra level to minimize the amount of damage you take. Level 4 is often then skipped in favor of finding other ways to defend yourself or making your offensive potential better to where you don't need that 4th level. Stuff like shield chargers, force fields, and a variety of other things can grant you that extra defense if you need it at a much lower cost. This is especially true depending on which boss you're going to be facing. Notably, Necrobarge and even Starflayer don't really need level 4 shields, and the Doom engine, having the most firepower, can be the main time I see people go for level 4 shields, kind of as like a desperate play if they don't have a lot of other defenses for the big barrage that the Doom engine does with its energy burst. However, if you are playing on lower torments right now and you are always upgrading your shields to level 4, it would be good practice to try to play with level 3 shields and look for other things, because that 200 plus scrap you're spending on level 4 shields can be much more effectively used with additional systems or upgrading other systems multiple times. And it is good practice for higher torments that often you do not have the ability to afford level 4 shields. Next up, your engines are your main way to generate evasion during combat. Engines must be powered and upgraded in order to grant you more and more evasion. This also requires a manned and powered command throne to actually get the evasion, but the engines are what are actually generating the evasion for you to utilize. Engines give a linear series of upgrades, up to a maximum of 8. Each level gives an additional 5 potential evasion to your stat, but they grow progressively more expensive, with the final level of engines costing 120 scrap and needing to be powered. In general, engines are not upgraded anywhere near that level because it is just far too expensive compared to most other things. Remember, we talked about how level 4 shields for 180 scrap was often too expensive to do. Engines, once they start to get like to level 4 or 5, start to reach that same cost point, and by the higher end, they're costing even more without giving you extra benefits. In general, it is advised that you may want to upgrade your engines once or twice in order to get access to level 3 or 4 engines. The reason for this is that that's about the point where they start to get too expensive to upgrade anymore, and they also do give you a decent amount of evasion. But the bigger thing as well is that if you upgrade your engines early, there are many gold events that require you to have level 3 or level 4 engines in order to actually use. So upgrading engines for 20, 30 scrap is not a big deal if you can even just find one of those gold events. Note, you don't even have to power the engine, so you can even just buffer it up to level 3 or 4 and then not power it. It also is a decent place to dump excess power during a fight. Let's say you have like a lance weapon, or you're going into the final boss and you have like 30 or 40 scrap left over. You can dump a level of energy into engines to get a little bit more evasion, and it helps out here or there. The main thing I would say is probably just not going above level 4. 20 evasion is generally the most you need, and that is the highest level that is required for gold events. So anything above that generally is just too expensive and is diminishing in returns. The third system we're going to talk about is life support. Life support essentially is what gives your ship oxygen, and without life support, your entire crew would eventually suffocate. Life support can technically be upgraded and powered in order to increase the amount of oxygen that refills rooms that are empty of it. So at level 2, it will fill 3 times as fast, and at level 6, it will refill 6 times as fast. However, there's not really a lot to say. You don't really need the higher levels of life support. It's not worth it in scrap, and there's essentially no point where life support really needs it. Generally, the only time I could ever see upgrading it is if you are like really desperate and you want to buffer life support so it doesn't go down when it takes damage, but that is so niche, and you really should just send someone to repair it when it takes damage. It's not a very crucial system in most cases, and if your life support is down and your whole crew suffocates, probably there was other things that were going to kill you anyway. It's best to save your scrap for other stuff and never really upgrade this. Weapons Bay is the 4th system that you will found on the vast majority of ships. The Weapons Bay is interesting, and is probably the hardest of the systems for me to talk about because it is the most volatile in terms of how much you want to upgrade it. Because sometimes you really need like almost a max weapons bay in order to maximize and use some really high-end stuff. Other times, you may only need to upgrade it to like level 3 or 4 and have a handful of basic weapons, and then you find your power in other systems. I guess in a general sense, Weapons Bay, you should probably expect to upgrade it to about level 5 or 6, assuming you found a decent 4 weapons to utilize. They don't even need to be like particularly powerful weapons. As long as you are utilizing other systems to support the Weapons Bay, it allows you to get a good mixed balance of these different systems. Going all in on Weapons Bay can have risks if the enemy has shield chargers, or especially when they get to like level 4 shields, they can prove quite difficult to overcome. So you got to make sure not to overinvest in the Weapons Bay. But there have been times that I have gotten like all 8 weapon bay upgrades in order to power like multiple high-end weapons. So it's something you're going to have to just kind of feel out, but I would recommend being cautious about the last 2 levels of the weapons bay. Those are very, very expensive, so you really got to make sure that if you're getting them, you are using them for extremely powerful weapons. Do not spend 90 scrap and upgrade a reactor cell in order to power a bolt cannon. That's not going to be worth it compared to like finding an entire new system or upgrading multiple systems or all of that. From here on out, we're now going to be getting into systems that you're very often going to have to be purchasing. Some ships may have these systems pre-installed, but we've covered most of the systems that pretty much every ship is going to be featuring, and now we're going to get into the ones where you're going to have to initially buy them. So we'll talk about that factoring in as well. So let's start here with the launch bay. The launch bay is essentially the first source of boarding that you will generally encounter in the game. It's installed on the first ship, and if it's not installed on the ship, you can pay 70 scrap for it. The launch bay starts with the ability to have 2 crew members board the enemy ship. It can be upgraded 2 times, for 30 scrap initially and then 60 scrap, and each upgrade gives it a quicker cooldown, meaning you can use it more often, and also increases the capacity by 1, meaning a max level launch bay can send 4 crew members over to the enemy ship per launch. Generally, the launch bay is in a bit of a weird spot right now. On its own, in a vacuum, it's a good way to get boarding onto the enemy ship. However, in the context of the game, it is one of the more expensive ways to actually board enemy ships. This is because stuff like heavy translocators, Aether Gate, and a variety of other things just kind of board enemy ships for much cheaper investments overall. As such, generally, you should only be really picking up launch bay if you are really desperate for boarding and are struggling to find any other source of it. It's something that is also nice to have on your ship. If you have it pre-installed, it can generally be good to throw 30 scrap and upgrade it, because sending 3 or even 4 crew members over can be worth it for bigger late game fights. But as a baseline, sending 2 crew members over for 70 scrap and a reactor power is enough that if you can find like a translocator or something else that lets you get on the enemy ship, it can be a decent purchase. But generally, I would say keep an eye out for other boarding options, because they're often a lot cheaper. If that changes ever in the future, the launch bay is probably going to be a solid option. It's never like inherently bad. It's just hard to recommend at the moment because other boarding methods are so much more effective and don't have some of the quirks of launch bay, like not being able to land exactly where you want. Next up is the Graviton field generator. This is an activatable system that, when used, will slow all units on the enemy ship, making them extremely slow while it is active. It costs 30 scrap to initially purchase and then can be upgraded 2 times, costing 30 scrap and then 70 scrap for the respective upgrades. The upgrades just simply increase its overall duration, with a baseline of 10, then going 15 and 20. The Graviton field generator at first glance might not look like anything special. However, for only 30 scrap, its baseline is actually really nice, and it's a system that works very well with a boarding crew or with something that is looking to spread like fire or breaches onto the enemy ship. The reason for this is that, for example, stuff like fire requires the enemy crew to run over there and extinguish it. However, if they're moving extremely slow, it gives you time for the fire to spread, making it harder for the enemy crew to contain and more likely getting damage on key systems. And when you are boarding is when it shines the most, because if you board the enemy ship and then activate it just as the enemies are reaching the room of your boarders, they take time to get into their specific tile. Keep in mind, crew will only deal damage when they are in a specific tile to actually fight. When they are moving, they do not deal damage, meaning that slowing movement often gives you several seconds of essentially free damage on them. This means that if you time it correctly, the Graviton can essentially be almost a stun effect, which can be very useful for getting very strong fights and free kills on enemy units with strong boarders. It does take a little bit of time to learn how to actually use this, but once you get it going, it can be a very cheap and effective purchase. Not something you should always slam dunk buy, but if you're doing well and you're reaching sort of the mid to late game, it can be a nice little power bump that helps to really reinforce whatever strategy you are utilizing. It's just overall a solid little thing. I generally wouldn't even upgrade it though, because the extra costs in order to get just a slightly longer duration doesn't really matter. Generally, you want to use it just for those 10 seconds to like get crucial things off, and then that is more than enough from it. So the first level is a good purchase. The upgrades are kind of and aren't really worth buying. Next up, for 80 scrap to purchase, the Husk Rack. The Husk Rack is essentially a system that every 7 seconds it will construct a basic husk that only lasts for that specific jump. Whenever you jump, all the Husk Rack units will die. These husks start off as the same as the ones you can find normally, 15 health and 3 DPS. However, they can be upgraded in order to get stronger effects. For 25 scrap, they will get +1 DPS and move fast. For 50 scrap after that, they will then become ionized husks, meaning that when they die, if they are on the enemy ship, they will ionize the system, causing some stun on that respective system. The rack got some buffs in a recent patch that made it more affordable and overall a lot better than it used to be. However, that initial asking price of 80 scrap is pretty rough. The reason for this is that you have to wait often about 14 to 21 seconds in order to have all of your husks ready to go, meaning that if you're going to be throwing them on the enemy ship, that is often after the first barrage has happened. And generally, with how fights go in Void War, the first like 20 to 30 seconds are often very important to minimize damage. So waiting around can be a bit of a tough ask. If you have the rack pre-installed, it's actually pretty good to throw some upgrades on it. At least the first level to get the extra DPS and fast movement. Both of those are useful either for manning systems or for stuff like just throwing them onto the enemy ship and them doing a bit more damage. It's just overall hard to justify with its initial asking price. If it was cheaper or there was like a little bit more to it, I could see myself recommending it as a way to bolster your overall crew. But as it stands, I think it sits at a bit too expensive, and I would not generally recommend picking it up. It's better if you invest the scrap into something a bit more meaningful right now. The Missile Bay is the first of the systems we're going to talk about that are purely offensive and are not related to the Weapons Bay. It costs 45 scrap for an initial purchase and will come with a Gladius missile, essentially the most basic and generic missile you can find, but you can also find different missile schematics that allow you to fire different ones. The Missile Bay can be upgraded 2 times. The first for 50 scrap, giving you a 15% charge speed bonus, and then level 3 requires 70 scrap for a 30% charge speed bonus. In general, the basic Missile Bay is an extremely useful system and is something I almost consider a must-buy. Missiles ignore shields on the enemy ships, meaning that they are great ways to get that initial damage into systems, allowing you to more effectively overwhelm and then bring enemy shields down effectively. It can also be great for sniping systems that are dealing constant damage to you, like siege weapons, or just crippling the enemy weapon bay just enough in order to effectively stop some big scary weapon from getting its barrage off. especially once you find some stronger missiles that start dealing 2 or more damage or have additional effects. The missile bay is just a very flexible and versatile system that works on almost every ship you find it for. The upgrades are admittedly not that useful. Paying, pretty much for the missile bay again to get 15% faster charging speed is a very minor upgrade. You can do it if you're swimming in scrap or you have a really strong missile that you want to utilize a lot, but keep in mind the missile bay also needs munitions, meaning that you have to manage it in order to not run out of them. So upgrading the charge speed means you can burn through missiles quicker, which means you need to buy more munitions. So it overall just becomes, I think, a bit too expensive to maintain the high level missile bays, and just having level 1 is often enough. It's a very basic purchase, but it works decently well, and I think is generally something you should look to grab. It can be a great way to quickly bolster an offensive, even with just its most basic version. The shield charger is a system that costs 80 scrap and must be activated during combat in order to utilize it. When active, it turns your shields into a green color and gives them a ultra fast recharge rate, effectively meaning that while it is active, it is nearly impossible for enemy weapons to actually penetrate through your shields. This is an incredible system and one of the must-buys that I highly recommend you get every time you see it. This is because being able to just essentially ignore an enemy barrage is extremely strong, and can mean even dangerous enemy armaments can be completely negated the first time they fire every fight. The shield charger can be upgraded 2 times, the first for 30 scrap and the second for 60 scrap, increasing the duration by 5 seconds per level. So from 10 up to 15 and then to 20 seconds. However, in general, the shield charger actually does not need many upgrades. Similar to the Graviton field, the base level is more than enough. Those 10 seconds is often easy enough to activate and completely negate whatever barrage is coming your way, and then it's not going to be needed again for essentially until it's off cooldown. Overall, it is just such a good system and is such a great way to bolster your defenses. It completely trivializes bosses like the Doom engine, whose entire gimmick is to overwhelm you with giant energy bursts. A level 1 shield charger can literally be used to negate every single one of those barrages. The only time I think you should really upgrade the shield charger is if you have excess scrap and you want to buffer it. Because having shield chargers on level 1s mean that if it takes any damage, it can break down and leave you without the shield charging active. So a level 2 shield charger, even if not powered, can give you that little bit of health to make it so one random blast doesn't completely cripple the charger. Regardless though, being able to just have a I'm immune button is so good that I would honestly recommend even selling something if you need to in order to purchase the shield charger. It is such a powerful thing and gives you so much survivability. It is extremely hard to ever pass up on it. Next, let's go ahead and talk about actually a pair of systems, the Siege Beam and the Siege Bombard. Both of these are offensive systems that focus on being activated for 3 munitions every fight, where they will then just repeatedly fire a weapon after charging up. They do have some differences, like for example the Siege Bombard is 50 scrap, the Siege Beam is 60 scrap to purchase, and on top of that their upgrades can vary a bit in cost. However, they both essentially are there to give you that extra offensive potential to kill enemy ships. Each of their upgrades essentially just increases their offensive potential, making them shoot faster or having larger beam length and all of that. Both siege weapons are decent pickups and are mostly useful against higher powered ships. In the smaller regular fights that you run into, these siege weapons can become very expensive to use at 3 munitions a pop. However, for mini bosses and especially the boss, siege weapons are often at a base level pretty good in that you can activate them once and they will just repeatedly do stuff. I would say the Siege Bombard might be a bit more useful if you're looking for innate like offensive boosting, because their projectiles will help to bring down levels of shield, and especially upgraded to fire faster, the Siege Bombard is able to suppress an enemy shield level, and once shields are down will repeatedly ping and damage systems. The Siege Beam is a bit more of a snowball card in that once the shields are down, it will absolutely start to massacre enemy ships and systems. However, you do need to be able to bring down the shields in order to make it actually do anything. So it's a little bit more of a risk versus reward upgrade in my opinion. However, both can be decent pickups if you're looking for a little bit of extra lethality going into late game bosses or into just fights in general that you need to burst down, like possess ships in later sectors. They just aren't something that you want to be using every single fight, and as such the upgrades can be a bit situational. Kind of something you maybe throw the scrap into in the last sector where you have excess scrap and you can get a little bit more out of them. But otherwise, level 1s is probably the most you want to do for the early to mid game at least. The Hull Reaper is our next offensive system. It costs 1 munition to fire and is 60 scraps to initially purchase, but it will fire a slow-moving beam that every time it damages a room in the enemy ship, it has a 50% chance of healing your ship for 1 health, effectively meaning it is both an offensive and a defensive weapon. The Hull Reaper can be upgraded 2 times. The first level is for 60 scrap, and it effectively halves the cooldown time of the Hull Reaper. And then the next level is 80 scrap and gives the Hull Reaper the ability to pierce level 1 shields. I would probably say the Hull Reaper is the strongest offensive system in the entire game. It is almost a must-buy on the level of Shield Charger, because the ability to not only damage enemy systems, but also to have healing built into that, on top of also it having a fairly common and strong gold event, means that even just having the Hull Reaper on your ship is a really good thing, even if you're not actively using it every single fight. It just helps to manage your hull health so well. It gives you that extra offensive potential. There's just not a lot it doesn't do well, and on top of that, the upgrades are actually quite meaningful. Level 2, to have the cooldown time, changes the Hull Reaper from being something you maybe use once a fight to something you can be using 2 or 3 times a fight, which is very, very useful. Level 3 is a bit more of a luxury, because usually you want to be having the ability to just break shields entirely, but the shield piercing can be useful if your offensive is a bit lacking in that regard. Still, even just the most basic level of the Hull Reaper is very useful, and I would generally recommend getting it anytime you see it. It's just overall a generically strong thing, and as long as you're not like limited on munitions, it's a very, very useful pickup. The Thrall Pit for 75 scrap is a system that acts very similar to the Husk Rack in its overall design. It does have some overall differences. For example, at the baseline, it takes 14 seconds for it to construct 1 husk at level 1, and it can have a maximum of 2 thralls. Upgrades costing 30 and then 60 scrap will increase the total number of thralls you can have and the build speed. At max level, it will have a 7-second build time and can have a total of 4 thralls. Thralls themselves are weaker in combat and repair capability than a husk. However, they do have synergy with a blood cult. Most notably, many spells require thralls to be sacrificed to get more out of them. Usually, the best one to be talked about with this is the Blood Spear, a 1 damage projectile that never misses, and if a thrall is sacrificed, goes on a 3-second cooldown. The Thrall Pit is a system that I would generally only recommend picking up if you already have blood spells that are able to utilize it. If the Husk Rack is not a great system on its own, then the Thrall Pit is not a very good one either. However, if you do have ways to turn the Thralls into more powerful spells with the sacrifices, then the Thrall Pit actually gains a lot more value and can be a very solid pickup. Of course, having extra crew members to go repair or put out fires or just throw into combat can be okay, even though the Thralls themselves are fairly underwhelming. The Thrall Pit is a good enabler of the blood spells, so it's very situational. I would pick this up. However, if you do have stuff like Blood Spear, then I would definitely recommend maxing out the level on this Thrall Pit, because having 7-second Thralls can make Blood Spear a machine gun that is able to very rapidly break enemy systems. However, as I said, if you don't have any blood-related synergies with the Thrall Pit, I would probably skip on it. And now we move on to actually the final of the systems that you are able to purchase. That is the Terror Amplifier. For 40 scrap, the Terror Amplifier is able to be used and will launch a Psychic Blast that will stun enemy crew for 5 seconds in the target room. It costs 35 scrap and then 60 scrap to upgrade to higher levels, and essentially the upgrades shave 5 seconds off the cooldown each. The Terror Amp obviously works well with boarding crews, and that is the main purpose of it. Being able to just repeatedly stun enemy crew members while your crew gets free damage on them can help you crew kill much more effectively and minimize the damage that your boarders are taking. The baseline level of the Terror Amplifier is generally pretty nice already. The higher levels are a bit pricey for what is effectively a very small cooldown reduction, although if you do have excess scrap and don't have anywhere to put it, it can be a decent thing, because using it more often obviously means you get more stuns, which is less damage on your boarders, and on and on and on. It's not something that I will jump at the bit to get. Like, I would not sell stuff to get it, unlike some of the other systems we talked about. But if you do have like a free slot in your systems and you do have 40 scrap and you're not like crucially looking to get anything else, it's a decent enough pickup. I've never really felt bad using the Terror Amp, because keep in mind, it can also target your own ship. So it is also able to be defensive if you are needing to like deal with some dangerous boarder that has gotten on your ship. It can do that and help you to kind of control things a bit better. And with that, we have reached the end of our video. This is quite a long one, talking about a lot of different systems. There's no way to really recap all of this, but hopefully you found the information in this video useful. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe. I hope the video is able to help you get better with managing your scrap as you climb in Torments. And otherwise, I don't have a lot more to say. If you've watched all the way to the end, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good one.